Okay, welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And this is basically take four because I had to do yet another rewrite on this particular story that's sort of developing. And as you all surely know, Israel recently started attacking Iran, and Iran has retaliated. So early Thursday morning, Iran unleashed a volley of some 20 ballistic missiles at Israel, including one that struck the Soroka Medical Center in Beersheba, the largest hospital serving roughly 1 million people in southern Israel. Emergency protocols were in place, an older surgery wing had been evacuated, underground shelters reactivated, and parking garages converted into makeshift wards. So the strike caused extensive damage and sparked a suspected localized chemical leak, forcing ambulatory services to triage only life threatening cases. Of the approximately 271 wounded in the attacks, around 71 suffered minor injuries at Soroka, another dozen were moderately or seriously hurt. Elsewhere, none fatally, at least according to the reports I've seen. If anyone has updates otherwise, feel free to let me know. Meanwhile, in the Tel Aviv Ramat Gan area, high rise and residential buildings absorbed four additional missile strikes. Local reports mentioned fires in upper floors, occupants trapped during evacuations, and heart wrenching reunions like a father finally finding his missing wife and child. So, Israel's Home Front Command described one missile as a dispersal munition, essentially a ballistic cluster warhead, releasing roughly 20 bomblets at about 4 miles altitude, scattering across a 5-mile radius. Each bomblet approximates the damage potential of a short range rocket, prompting emergency warnings to civilians about dangerous unexploded fragments. Israeli leaders responded swiftly. Defense Minister Israel Katz condemned the strike as a grievous war crime, declaring Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei should no longer be allowed to exist. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed Israel would make Tehran pay the full price, ordering intensified attacks on Iranian military and government targets, or at least that's what he is saying. Of course, there may very well end up civilian targets. Israel has targeted facilities like Iran's nuclear reactor, the ARAK, that's how it's spelled. It's part of a wave of Israeli strikes that analysts say amount to aggression and breaches of the Geneva Conventions, destroying civilian infrastructure and killing both soldiers and non-combatants. Iran asserts it acts in self-defense, pointing to their strikes as justification for its bombardment of Israeli cities, or pointing to the Israeli strikes as justification. So, what we're seeing here in general is a lot of selective outrage and double standards. Israel's immediate declaration of Iranian actions as war crimes rings hollow in light of its own documented offenses in Gaza. In May 2025, Israeli forces dropped over 50 bunker busting bombs on the Gaza European Hospital, one of the largest recent hospital strikes in the region. Under international humanitarian law, striking hospitals and civilian centers constitutes war crimes, yet Western governments and media that swiftly condemn Iranian fire remain conspicuously silent on Gaza, even now, at least in many cases. And Gaza, of course, suffers disproportionately and repeatedly. On civilian targeting, regarding that, while Iran's use of cluster like munitions is condemned as reckless, and rightly so, Israel regularly deploys bunker busting munitions in Gaza's densely populated areas, killing hundreds and flattening residential zones. The principle of proportionality, which is meant to protect civilians, appears breached on a regular and intentional basis, yet Israeli officials claim self defense, even as Gaza hospitals, schools, and shelters are systematically bombed. And, state power and unaccountability is on full display. All of the states involved, regardless of their rhetoric, frequently commit violence under the guise of national security. Israel's charge of war crimes against Iran is hypocritical when it simultaneously violates the same international agreements it invokes. Labeling opponents as criminal while exempting oneself is typical statecraft and not moral leadership. So, Iran's missile barrage wounded dozens, struck a major hospital, and damaged civilian buildings near Tel Aviv, provoking Israeli leadership to declare war crimes and threaten regime decapitation. Israel's counterstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure have themselves been flagged by independent legal experts as aggressive violations of international law. So the moral framing here, with Israel accusing Iran of war crimes while committing those very acts in Gaza, reveals a stark hypocrisy and selective moral outrage, especially from Western allies who support Israel militarily and diplomatically. It's important to know who started a fight first. However, overemphasizing the logic of "you did it first" ensures everyone loses. If we genuinely oppose war crimes, there must be universal accountability, not only when state violence aligns with our chosen side's narratives. So, okay, that's the big news story out of the way. And today we're going to look at a specific Israeli official, Ehud Olmert. He is what I call the peripheral poop head of the week. And Olmert is Israel's top, he found his way into Israel's top political echelons. And despite not being the absolute worst villain that Israel has ever produced, in fact, in some ways, he might even be said to be a relatively good uh, character in the Israeli government, but he still has a noticeably flawed legacy, and I'm going to get into some of that here today. So, Ehud Olmert was a lawyer educated at. Well, I shouldn't say was. He still is alive. He's a lawyer educated at Hebrew University. Entered the Knesset at 28, championing fights against organized crime and political graft within the right wing Likud bloc. He was mayor of Jerusalem from 1993 to 2003. Sorry, it's a bit of a tongue twister for me, apparently. But in 1993, Olmert unseated long serving mayor Teddy Kollek, becoming Jerusalem's first Likud affiliated mayor. He consolidated power and won re election in 1998. While in office, he controversially backed and later became embroiled in the massive Holy Land luxury housing project, central to his later corruption case. And he did see a return to national politics. In 2003, Ariel Sharon, who I will discuss more a little bit later, he brought Olmert back to the national stage as vice prime minister and trade minister. Once a hawkish voice, Olmert seemingly pivoted. He helped implement the Gaza disengagement plan and proposed a unilateral West Bank withdrawal, the 2006 Convergence Plan, as it was called, which aimed to relinquish control over 90% of the territory while annexing large settlement blocks. After Netanyahu resigned in protest over disengagement, Olmert served briefly as acting finance minister in late 2005. So there was also the formation of Kadima and a premiership. Sharon's 2005 split from Likud led Omeret into Kadima, a centrist party. When Sharon suffered a debilitating stroke in 2006, Omeret assumed the role of acting prime minister. So he was the prime minister at the time of the 2006 Lebanon war, and it was just months into his term when Hezbollah captured two Israeli soldiers, which is said to provoke the 34-day Second Lebanon War. It resulted in around 1,200 Lebanese and 150 Israelis killed, failing to secure the hostages or to neutralize Hezbollah. So he was sharply criticized for his leadership during that crisis, which, of course, some would say that was not a necessary crisis. It prompted mass protests and plummeted his approval ratings. So between 2007 and 2009, Omeret pursued peace, actually, at, at least from certain perspectives. He led the Annapolis Conference and initiated direct negotiations with Palestinian leaders, yet talks stalled amid rising hostilities, culminating in another outbreak of conflict in 2008 and 2009. And then there's the downfall and convictions. Corruption allegations shadowed dog no shadowed Omeret throughout his prime ministership, derived largely from his mayoral and trade ministry tenures. In March 2008, amid emerging investigations, he resigned leadership. New elections occurred in February 2009, with Netanyahu returning to power. So after leaving office in 2009, Omeret faced lengthy trials. In 2014, he was convicted in the Holy Land affair, which I did mention earlier. It was about accepting bribes linked to the controversial Jerusalem real estate project. Judge David Rosen likened bribery by public servants to treason, sentencing him to 6 years in prison and ordering a large fine. A retrial added charges in the Talensky case, which were secret U.S. donations during his time as mayor, and he began serving a 19-month sentence in February 2016, the first time an Israeli prime minister served jail time. Post release, Omeret has turned into a vocal critic of Netanyahu. In 2025, he accused Israel's ongoing Gaza operations of war crimes, calling current policies indiscriminate, limitless, and cruel, alleging intentional civilian harm and starvation in a in an op-ed in Haaretz. So Omeret's trajectory exemplifies how power structures, whether right wing or centrist, can co opt progressive rhetoric, including peace plans and disengagement, while perpetuating state violence, hierarchical authority, and systemic corruption. So, the contextual takeaway here is that Omeret's story shows how political actors, even those advocating negotiations or withdrawal, ultimately embed into the same frameworks that enable war, surveillance, and elite scandals. Whether Likud or Kadima, the structure remains. States perpetuate borders, military coercion, and property regimes. The Holy Land scandal perfectly illustrates how such hierarchies incentivize private gain using public office. And of course, real freedom from such cycles requires dismantling these corrupting institutions entirely, or to the extent possible at least, and temporary reforms and later condemnations don't escape the structural logic that produces war and corruption in the first place. All right, so continuing with the fun episode, obviously this is uh, full of a lot of heavy topics, but we're also going to look at Ariel Sharon and the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. So the biggest scandal involving Ariel Sharon was the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982. This event defined much of the controversy around his political and military career and carries deep ethical, political, and legal implications, especially from an anti authoritarian perspective. So, what happened? What was the Sabra and Shatila massacre? During Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, Sharon was serving as defense minister. After Israeli forces took West Beirut, they allowed Lebanese Christian Phalangist militias, who were allied with Israel and had a vendetta against Palestinians, to enter the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, which were populated mainly by Palestinian civilians. And over the course of 3 days, these militias massacred between 800 and 3,500 people, including women, children, and the elderly. The Israeli Kahan Commission later found that Sharon bore personal responsibility for failing to prevent the massacre, even if he didn't directly order it. He was forced to resign as defense minister, but remained in politics and later became prime minister. So the issue here is rooted in opposition. If you're rooted in opposition to illegitimate power, militarism, and hierarchical violence, this scandal embodies multiple layers of systemic failure and state criminality. I mean, there's state violence and proxy warfare. Sharon's actions really show the outsourcing of brutality to allied militias, which is a hallmark of imperialist strategy, allowing a sectarian militia to enter a refugee camp, knowing the risk of retaliatory violence, and it's a deliberate abdication of moral responsibility in service of state objectives. This reflects the state's willingness to protect its legitimacy while delegating its bloodiest work, a form of indirect domination common in empire building. And this was militarism as policy. The invasion of Lebanon and Sharon's overall military doctrine were driven by a belief in preemptive, overwhelming force, and it's a logic that treats civilians as collateral damage or pawns. Sharon's career really exemplifies how state militarism dehumanizes and centralizes decision making power in the hands of a few, divorced from accountability. This case also demonstrates the impunity of power. Even after being found responsible, Sharon's political career wasn't over. He returned to become prime minister in 2001. This is a clear case of elite impunity, where those with power are shielded from consequences, reinforcing a system that elevates loyalty over justice. And there's also the colonialism and ethno nationalism aspect. Sharon was a key architect of Israeli settlements and believed in Jewish sovereignty over all of Greater Israel. This ideology, enforced militarily, is a form of settler colonial domination. The massacre occurred within the broader context of colonial suppression of Palestinians, where even refugee camps weren't safe from retribution. So the Sabra and Shatila massacre is the apex scandal of Ariel Sharon's career, exposing how state systems enable atrocity through militarism, proxy violence, and political impunity. So it's a brutal case study of how hierarchical power structures create the conditions for mass violence while insulating those at the top from accountability.